What happens when one of Australia's most beloved icons walks onto a daytime talk show, expecting a friendly chat, and instead finds himself in the fight of his life? Paul Hogan, the man who made the world fall in love with Crocodile Dundee, sat down on The View for what was supposed to be a light conversation about his legacy, his life down under, and maybe a few laughs about throwing shrimp on the Barbie. But what unfolded was something nobody saw coming, a clash so intense that it left the studio audience gasping, the host scrambling, and Hogan himself pushed to a breaking point that shocked everyone watching. Before we dive into this explosive moment, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us what you think about what went down here. The segment began innocently enough. Whoopi Goldberg introduced Hogan with warmth and genuine affection, highlighting his contributions to film and his status as an international treasure. The audience applauded enthusiastically as Hogan walked out, flashing that signature crooked smile that had charmed millions. He settled into his seat, exchanged pleasantries with the panel, and seemed ready for what he probably thought would be a nostalgic trip down memory lane. Sonny Hostin kicked things off with a softball question about his early days in Australian television, and Hogan delivered a charming anecdote about working on the Sydney Harbour Bridge before becoming a rigger on TV sets. The table laughed, the energy was light, and everything seemed to be going exactly as planned. Sarah N. followed up asking about the inspiration behind Crocodile Dundee, and Hogan leaned back, clearly in his element, talking about wanting to show the world a different side of Australia, one that was funny and self-aware but also proud. Then Joy Behar jumped in. Her tone shifted almost immediately, and anyone paying attention could sense the change in atmosphere. She started by acknowledging his success but then pivoted sharply, bringing up criticisms that had been leveled at Crocodile Dundee over the years, specifically about how it portrayed Indigenous Australians and whether the film leaned too heavily into stereotypes. Hogan's smile faded just a fraction, but he kept his composure, answering that the film was made with love and respect, that it was a comedy meant to celebrate Australian culture, not mock it, and that everyone involved had the best intentions. Behar wasn't satisfied. She pressed further, suggesting that good intentions don't always translate to good outcomes, and that perhaps Hogan, looking back, might see things differently now. There was an edge to her voice, a persistence that felt less like curiosity and more like an interrogation. Hogan's jaw tightened slightly, but he responded calmly, saying that he stood by his work, that the film had been embraced by audiences worldwide, including in Australia, and that he wasn't going to apologize for making people laugh and feel good. The other hosts seemed to sense the tension building. Whoopi tried to steer the conversation toward his other projects, asking about his tourism campaigns for Australia, but Behar cut back in, this time bringing up his tax issues from years ago, framing it as a question about responsibility and accountability. The shift was jarring, the audience murmured uncomfortably, and Hogan's entire demeanor changed. His easygoing charm was replaced by something harder, more guarded. He looked directly at Behar and said, in a measured but firm tone, that those issues had been resolved years ago, that he had been vindicated, and that bringing it up now felt less like journalism and more like a personal attack. Behar shot back, insisting she was just asking questions that people wanted answered, that public figures needed to be held accountable for their actions and their words. Hogan leaned forward, his voice still controlled but carrying an unmistakable intensity, and said that accountability goes both ways, that if she wanted to talk about responsibility, maybe they should discuss the responsibility of interviewers to treat their guests with basic respect instead of ambushing them on live television. The studio went dead silent. The other hosts exchanged glances, clearly unsure whether to intervene or let it play out. Behar, to her credit, didn't back down. She doubled down, saying that if he couldn't handle tough questions, maybe he shouldn't have agreed to come on the show. Hogan laughed, but there was no humor in it, just disbelief. He said he had no problem with tough questions, but there was a difference between tough and hostile, between holding someone accountable and grinding an axe. Whoopi finally stepped in, trying to defuse the situation by suggesting they take a breath and move on to something lighter. Maybe talk about his family or his life, now. But the damage was done, the tension was palpable, and Hogan was no longer the affable guest who had walked out minutes earlier. He nodded at Whoopi, acknowledging her attempt to smooth things over, but his eyes stayed locked on Behar, and it was clear this wasn't over. Behar, seemingly determined not to let it go, made one more comment, something about how celebrities often play the victim when confronted with uncomfortable truths. That was the spark that lit the fuse. Hogan's face flushed, his voice rose for the first time, and he said that he had spent his entire career being honest with people, making them laugh, sharing his culture, and he wasn't about to sit there and be lectured by someone who seemed more interested in scoring points than having an actual conversation. The audience gasped, some applauded, others sat frozen, unsure how to react. The other hosts looked stunned. Sonny tried to say something but stopped mid-sentence. Sarah looked down at her cards, and Whoopi's expression was one of someone watching a car crash in slow motion. knowing it was happening but unable to stop it. Behar, now visibly annoyed, said that maybe Hogan was proving her point, that he couldn't handle criticism, that he was too used to being adored and couldn't deal with being challenged. Hogan stood up slightly, not leaving his seat but shifting his weight forward, his voice now cutting through the studio like a knife. He said that he had been challenged his entire life, that he had worked harder than most people could imagine to get where he was, and that being challenged was one thing, but being disrespected was another, and he wasn't going to tolerate it, not from her, not from anyone. The confrontation had escalated beyond anything anyone expected, and what happened next would push it even further. Whoopi made another attempt to regain control, her voice cutting through the charged atmosphere with the authority of someone who had moderated countless heated discussions. She said that everyone needed to take a step back, that they could disagree without it becoming personal, and that maybe they should all remember they were on television. Hogan nodded slowly, settling back into his seat, but his expression made it clear he was far from done. He looked at Whoopi and said he appreciated her trying to keep things civil, but that civility required participation from everyone at the table, and so far he had been the only one showing restraint. Behar interjected immediately, saying that she found it interesting how men often accused women of being uncivil when they were simply being direct and asking hard questions. Hogan's eyes widened, and he let out a short, incredulous laugh. He said this had nothing to do with gender, that he had been interviewed by countless women throughout his career, many of whom had asked him far tougher questions than anything she had thrown at him, and he had never had a problem because those interviews were conducted with professionalism and respect. He said the difference was intent, that he could tell when someone was genuinely interested in a conversation, and when someone was just looking to create conflict for ratings. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Behar's face hardened, and she said that was a cheap shot, that she had been doing this job for decades and didn't need to manufacture conflict, that if there was conflict, it was because he had brought it with him. Hogan shook his head, his frustration now fully visible, and said that he had walked onto this set in good faith, ready to talk about his life, his work, his country, and instead he had been met with what felt like a prosecution. Sonny tried to interject, suggesting that maybe there was a misunderstanding, that perhaps both sides were talking past each other rather than to each other. Hogan turned to her and said there was no misunderstanding, that he understood perfectly well what was happening, and that he had been in this business long enough to recognize when someone had an agenda. He said he had no problem being challenged on his work, on his choices, on anything he had actually said or done, but that he did have a problem with being misrepresented and attacked for things that had already been settled, or taken out of context. Behar fired back, asking what exactly she had misrepresented, challenging him to be specific. Hogan didn't hesitate. He said that bringing up his tax issues as if they were some kind of unresolved scandal was a misrepresentation, that the Australian authorities had cleared him, that he had paid everything he owed, and that dragging it up again was nothing more than a smear tactic. He said that framing Crocodile Dundee as some kind of problematic film was also a misrepresentation, that the movie had been celebrated for decades, that it had opened doors for Australian cinema, and that trying to rewrite its legacy through a modern political lens was both unfair and dishonest. Behar responded by saying that just because something was popular didn't mean it was above criticism, that culture evolves, that society's understanding of representation and respect evolves, and that it was perfectly reasonable to look back at older works with a more critical eye. Hogan agreed, to everyone's surprise, saying that of course, culture evolves, that he wasn't some dinosaur who thought everything should stay frozen in time, but that there was a difference between thoughtful critique and performative outrage, between genuine conversation and virtue signaling. The phrase virtue signaling landed like a bomb. The audience reacted audibly, some gasping, some murmuring, and the other hosts all spoke at once, trying to manage the fallout. Behar's voice rose above the others, demanding to know if Hogan was seriously accusing her of virtue signaling, of not being genuine in her concerns. Hogan said he was calling it exactly what it looked like, that he had watched enough of these kinds of interviews to know when someone was more interested in looking good to their audience than in actually understanding the person sitting across from them. Sarah tried to redirect, asking Hogan about his upcoming projects, anything to shift the focus away from the escalating hostility. Hogan glanced at her, seemed to consider letting it go, but then looked back at Behar and said that he wanted to finish this conversation because he thought it was important. He said that one of the reasons he had agreed to come on the show was because he respected the platform, because he thought it was a place where real conversations could happen, but that what he was experiencing now was making him rethink that assessment. Behar said that if he was uncomfortable with real conversations, that was on him, not on her. Hogan leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a quieter but more intense register, and said that he had had real conversations in war zones, in the outback, in rooms with world leaders, and in pubs with regular people, and none of them had felt as hostile as this. He said that a real conversation required two people who were interested in understanding each other, not one person trying to score points while the other defended themselves from attacks. Whoopi raised her hand, literally putting it up between them, and said that they needed to pump the brakes because this was getting out of hand. She looked at Hogan and asked him directly if he felt ambushed. Hogan took a breath, seemed to weigh his words carefully, and said yes, that was exactly how he felt. He said he didn't mind tough questions, that he had answered tough questions his entire career, but that there was a tone and an approach here that felt designed to provoke rather than illuminate. Whoopi then turned to Behar and asked if that was her intention. Behar looked genuinely taken aback, insisting that her intention was simply to have an honest conversation, to ask the questions that she thought needed asking, and that if Hogan was feeling defensive, maybe that said more about him than about her. Hogan immediately responded, saying that calling someone defensive when they pushed back against unfair treatment was a classic tactic, that it was a way of dismissing legitimate objections by pathologizing them. The exchange was now a full-blown debate, and the rest of the panel seemed almost like spectators at this point. Behar accused Hogan of being unable to accept that times had changed, that the things he could get away with saying and doing in the past were no longer acceptable. Hogan shot back that he had never gotten away with anything, that he had always been accountable for his words and actions, and that the idea that he was some relic from a less enlightened era was both condescending and factually wrong. He pointed out that he had spent years working with Indigenous Australians, that he had used his platform to promote Australian culture and tourism, that he had created opportunities for other actors and filmmakers, and that reducing his legacy to a few cherry-picked controversies was an insult not just to him but to everyone who had worked with him. Behar countered that legacy was complicated, that people could do good things and still make mistakes, and that acknowledging those mistakes didn't diminish the good. Hogan agreed again, his tone sharp, saying that he had no problem acknowledging mistakes when he made them, but that he objected to being forced to apologize for things that weren't mistakes, for work that he was proud of, for a film that had brought joy to millions of people. He said that if Behar wanted to have a conversation about the complexities of representation in film, he was happy to have that conversation, but that she needed to approach it with honesty and good faith, not with a predetermined conclusion that he was guilty of something. The tension showed no signs of easing, and the conversation was about to take an even more dramatic turn. Behar shifted in her seat, her expression showing she was preparing for another round. She said that Hogan kept talking about good faith, but that maybe he needed to understand that for many people, especially those who had been marginalized or stereotyped in media, films like Crocodile Dundee weren't just harmless fun. They were part of a larger pattern of how certain cultures and communities were depicted. Hogan listened, his face unreadable, and when she finished, he said that he understood that perspective, that he genuinely did, but that intent and impact weren't always the same thing, and that judging a film made decades ago by standards that didn't exist at the time was fundamentally unfair. He continued, his voice steady but forceful, saying that when they made Crocodile Dundee, they consulted with people, they tried to be respectful, and they created something that the vast majority of Australians, including Indigenous Australians, embraced and enjoyed. He said that pretending otherwise, that acting as if the film was some kind of offensive disaster, was revisionist history at its worst. He said that if there were people who were hurt or offended, he was genuinely sorry for that, but that he wouldn't apologize for the film itself, for its success, or for the joy it brought to people around the world. Behar pounced on the conditional apology, saying that was exactly the problem, that he was willing to say sorry if people were offended, as if their feelings were the issue rather than the content itself. Hogan's patience, which had been wearing thin, finally snapped. He said that was a complete distortion of what he had just said, that she was twisting his words to fit her narrative, and that this was exactly why he felt ambushed. He said he had been clear, that he respected different perspectives, that he understood people could have issues with any piece of art, but that didn't make those issues automatically valid or the art automatically wrong. He went further, his voice rising with emotion, saying that he had poured his heart into that film, that it had been a love letter to his country, and that having someone who had never walked a day in his shoes, who had never experienced what it was like to be an Australian trying to show the world who they were, sit there and judge him based on a checklist of modern sensibilities was infuriating. He said that art wasn't created in a laboratory to meet political requirements, that it came from real people with real experiences, and that reducing it to a list of potential offenses missed the entire point of what creativity was supposed to be. The audience was completely absorbed now, some nodding in agreement, others looking conflicted, but everyone was engaged. Sonny attempted to mediate, suggesting that perhaps both Hogan and Behar were coming from places of genuine conviction, that they both cared deeply about these issues, just from different angles. Hogan acknowledged her point, saying he could accept that, but that caring deeply didn't give anyone the right to mischaracterize someone else's work or intentions. Behar responded by saying that she hadn't mischaracterized anything, that she had simply raised questions that others had raised, and that if Hogan was secure in his legacy, he shouldn't feel so threatened by those questions. Hogan's face showed pure disbelief. He said that framing his pushback as feeling threatened was another manipulation, that it was a way of invalidating his legitimate objections by making them seem like emotional weakness. He said he wasn't threatened by questions, he was offended by disrespect, and there was a massive difference. Whoopi tried once more to find common ground, asking Hogan what he wished people understood about his work that perhaps they didn't. Hogan took a moment, visibly trying to collect himself, and said that he wished people understood that Crocodile Dundee was made by a working-class guy who got lucky, who saw an opportunity to show the world a version of Australia that was fun and adventurous and different from what they expected. He said it wasn't meant to be a documentary. It wasn't meant to be a comprehensive representation of every aspect of Australian society. It was meant to be an entertaining film that made people smile, and by that measure, it had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest dreams. He added that he was proud of what they had accomplished, that the film had put Australian cinema on the map in a way nothing else had, and that it had created opportunities for countless other filmmakers and actors who came after him. He said that if people wanted to critique specific elements of the film, fine, but that the overall legacy was undeniably positive, and he wasn't going to let anyone rewrite that history just because it was fashionable to be critical of everything. Behar jumped back in, saying that being proud of something didn't make it immune from criticism, that every piece of art could and should be examined, and that Hogan's defensiveness suggested maybe he wasn't as comfortable with his legacy as he claimed. Hogan's composure finally shattered completely. He raised his voice, not quite shouting, but close, and said that he was done being analyzed by someone who clearly had an agenda, that he had tried to engage respectfully, that he had answered every question honestly, and that all he had gotten in return was accusations and implications. He said that if this was what passed for conversation on The View, then maybe the show had lost its way, that maybe it had become more interested in creating viral moments than in having meaningful discussions. He said that he had come on the show because he thought it mattered, because he thought it was a place where real dialogue could happen, but that he was now realizing he had been mistaken. The words landed like a slap, and the studio fell into a stunned silence. Sarah tried to salvage something, saying that surely there was value in the conversation they were having, that difficult discussions were important even when they were uncomfortable. Hogan looked at her and said that difficult discussions were important, but that this hadn't been a discussion, it had been an interrogation. He said that a discussion required listening, required trying to understand the other person's perspective, and that he had felt none of that from Behar. Behar, her own frustration now fully visible, said that she had listened, that she had heard everything he said, and that she simply disagreed with him. That disagreement wasn't the same as not listening. Hogan shot back that disagreement was fine, that he had no problem with disagreement, but that the way she had approached the conversation, the tone, the implications, the constant reframing of his words, that wasn't disagreement. That was hostility dressed up as journalism. Whoopi stood up slightly, a clear signal that she was about to take control, and said that they needed to wrap this up, that they had gone way beyond what anyone had anticipated, and that maybe it was time to agree to disagree and move on. Hogan nodded, but before he could say anything, Behar got in one last comment, saying that she hoped Hogan would reflect on this conversation and maybe reconsider some of his positions. That final remark ignited something in Hogan that had been building throughout the entire segment, and what came next would define the entire interview. Hogan turned to face Behar directly, his entire body language shifting into something more confrontational than anything that had come before. He said that he would reflect on this conversation, absolutely, but probably not in the way she hoped. He said he would reflect on how someone could sit across from another human being, someone who had come on their show voluntarily, and treat them with such thinly veiled contempt. He said he would reflect on how the art of conversation had apparently died, replaced by gotcha journalism and moral grandstanding. His voice was shaking now, not with fear or weakness, but with genuine anger that had been building for the entire segment. He said that he had spent 50 years in the entertainment industry, that he had worked with thousands of people from every background imaginable, and that he had always tried to treat everyone with respect and dignity. He said that coming onto this show, he had expected the same courtesy, but instead he had been treated like a defendant in a trial he didn't know he was attending. Behar tried to interrupt, but Hogan held up his hand and kept going. He said that she wanted to talk about accountability. So let's talk about accountability. He said that hosts had accountability too, that they had a responsibility to their guests, to their audience, and to the truth. He said that cherry-picking controversies, ignoring context, and framing everything through the most uncharitable lens possible wasn't holding anyone accountable. It was character assassination, and he wasn't going to stand for it. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. Whoopi had sat back down, seemingly recognizing that there was no stopping this, that it needed to play out. Hogan continued, saying that Behar had mentioned his tax issues, something that had been resolved years ago, after a long and painful legal battle that had nearly destroyed him. He said that the Australian Taxation Office had admitted they were wrong, that he had been vindicated, and that bringing it up again as if it were some unresolved scandal was not only unfair, it was cruel. He said that she had questioned his film, his legacy, his character, all while hiding behind the excuse of just asking questions. He said that just asking questions was what people said when they wanted to make accusations without taking responsibility for them, that it was a coward's way of attacking someone. The word coward hung in the air, and Behar's face went pale. She started to respond, but Hogan wasn't finished. He said that if she had problems with Crocodile Dundee, if she thought it was problematic or offensive, then she should have said that directly, instead of couching it in hypotheticals and what other people thought. He said that if she thought he was a tax cheat, she should have said that instead of bringing it up as a casual question. He said that at least then it would have been honest. At least then he would have known what he was dealing with. But instead, she had spent the entire interview hiding behind plausible deniability while taking shots at him. Behar finally found her voice and said that she resented being called a coward, that she had been nothing but direct with him, and that if he couldn't handle direct questions, that was his problem. Hogan laughed, a bitter, harsh sound, and said that there was nothing direct about what she had been doing. That direct would have been saying what she actually thought instead of playing these rhetorical games. He said that direct would have been saying, I think your film is offensive, or I think you're a tax cheat. Not have you considered that some people might find your film offensive, or can you explain the tax issues that were totally resolved, but I'm bringing up anyway. Sunny tried to step in, her voice urgent, saying that everyone was getting too heated, that personal attacks weren't productive, and that they should all take a breath. Hogan looked at her and said that he appreciated her concern, but that he had taken plenty of breaths over the past 20 minutes, that he had tried repeatedly to engage respectfully, and that he was done being the only person in the conversation who was expected to maintain their composure. He turned back to Behar and said that she had asked him if he would reflect on this conversation, and he wanted her to know that he absolutely would. He said he would reflect on how someone who claimed to care about respect and representation could be so disrespectful to a guest. He said he would reflect on how someone who talked about holding people accountable seemed to think they themselves were above accountability. And he said he would reflect on whether shows like this, shows that used to stand for something meaningful, had become nothing more than platforms for performative conflict. Sarah made one last attempt to find something positive, asking Hogan if there was anything he had learned from the conversation, anything he was taking away from it. Hogan looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter but no less intense. He said that what he had learned was that some people were more interested in tearing others down than building anything up, that some people valued being right more than being fair, and that some conversations weren't worth having because the other person had no interest in actually listening. Behar said that was rich coming from someone who had spent the entire interview refusing to accept any criticism whatsoever. Hogan's eyes flashed, and he said that was an absolute lie. Batty had acknowledged multiple times that people could have different perspectives, that he had expressed genuine sympathy for anyone who felt hurt or offended, but that sympathy didn't mean surrender, that understanding someone's perspective didn't mean accepting their conclusions as fact. He said that the fundamental difference between them was that he believed people could disagree in good faith, that they could have different views without one of them being a villain, but that Behar seemed to operate from the assumption that anyone who disagreed with her was either ignorant or malicious. He said that kind of thinking was poison, that it killed any possibility of real dialogue, and that it was exactly what was wrong with so much of public discourse today. Whoopi finally intervened with real authority, saying that they were out of time, that this had been one of the most intense segments in the show's history, and that she thought both Hogan and Behar had made their positions abundantly clear. She thanked Hogan for coming on, though her tone suggested it was more of a diplomatic necessity than genuine gratitude. Hogan nodded at her, stood up, and before anyone could say anything else, he looked directly at the camera. He said that he wanted to speak directly to the people watching at home. He said that he had come on this show in good faith, hoping to have a real conversation about his life and work, and that what had happened instead was a perfect example of what happened when ideology trumped humanity, when scoring points became more important than understanding people. He said that he had no regrets about his career, about Crocodile Dundee, or about anything he had said during the interview. He said that he stood by his work, by his character, and by his right to defend himself when attacked. And then, without waiting for a response, without shaking hands or exchanging pleasantries, he removed his microphone, set it on the table, and walked off the set. The camera stayed on the panel, all of whom looked shell-shocked. Behar sat with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. Whoopi looked exhausted, Sarah looked uncomfortable, and Sunny looked like she was still processing what had just happened. Whoopi turned to the camera and said they would be right back after the break, her voice professional but strained. The segment had ended, but what had just unfolded would be talked about for a long time to come. So, what do you think? Was Paul Hogan right to erupt the way he did, or should he have kept his cool? Was Joy Behar asking legitimate tough questions, or did she cross a line? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next deep dive into the moments that have everyone talking.